what I'm going to be doing in the next 30 minutes is building a low-code application within Creatio. So I'm going to power through these slides, sort of like Deneen. I want to get to the meat of actually building this. So if you were at the Accelerate event, pretty much any session, you were pretty much hit over the head with the low-code messaging. But like Deneen said, this is important. It's really something that you're going to see more and more and more in the application development world, because it's fast, it's intuitive, and it really opens up the scope of who can design applications. And I put this stat in there before. Creatio put it inside of like every application, but Gartner predicts that at least 65% of application development will use low-code development tools within the next 4 to 5 years. So if you're not already using low-code development tools, you're going to be using them in the near future. What's really great for Creatio is they're already positioned to be a low-code application design tool. Creatio has numerous tools already built in to help you build out applications and areas within the application where you don't need to be a developer, you don't need to write any code. That includes things like the section wizard, business rules capability, the case designer, which you might hear referred to as DCM or dynamic case management, the process library, which you might hear referred to as BPM or business process management. And I think what's really great about Creatio is you've got this capability to really build on applications and then still share the same underlying database for your application, so you can share data freely among them. And so you can start with, maybe core CRM functionality when you start using Creatio, but you can very easily add these other purpose-built applications that may or may not directly interact with the CRM data, but they can where they need to without having to worry about integrations or any of that kind of overhead when you have all these separate data applications, sort of more traditional approach. So what we're going to do today is build one of these sort of purpose-built applications. A lot of people in their businesses need a place to track expenses from their employees, to have a place where employees can submit their expenses, maybe approve those expenses, track whether they've been paid. I'm not going to actually tie this to a payment system, but you certainly could through integration mechanisms, or even potentially building out something to do that within Creatio. So we're going to build an expenses section. We're going to add some business rules. We're going to add a case that's going to manage the status and the approvals of each expense. And then we're going to add some business processes. We want to timestamp some key actions and talk about other ways we could do approvals. Hopefully we can get all that done within less than 30 minutes. I think we can do it. I'll move a little bit quickly because of that. And in the interest of time, I have completed a couple of steps already, primarily to just avoid having to go through a couple of extra saves along the way. So I have already created and populated some values into a lookup for expense status. And I've also set up an email account that we can use if we want to send any email alerts within our process. So just both of those are quick, easy things to do. Like I said, it was really just a saving of a save more than anything else that I was worried about, in terms of time factors here. So I'm logged into Creatio. I'm going to go over to my system designer. And the first thing that we're going to do, well, first of all, I guess I'm already assuming in this scenario that I've figured out what my requirements are. I've decided what it is that I need to build. I've thought about what the process needs to look like, and I'm ready to start building it. I'm not going to, kind of show you that thinking part of the building process, but obviously that's really important to do before you start actually clicking on things within Creatio. So I know I want to build a new section in Creatio, and so I'm going to go to the section wizard, which is going to allow me to do that. This is going to open up and ask me what I want to build. So I want to build an expenses section. I'm going to give it a name, like kind of a person-friendly name. Whoops. And okay, come on now, computer, keep up. And a computer-friendly name. So the code is just going to be the backend name. Everything within Creatio is going to get a prefix of some sort, and mine right now is set to the default value of USR for it's the user section. So it's going to go ahead and acknowledge that information that I've put in. It's going to ask me to pick a workplace to put it in. You can have the section set up in multiple workplaces if you've got users using in different workplaces, and this would apply to multiple workplaces. This is just going to ask me to pick one as a starting point. I'm going to go ahead right now while I'm thinking about it, and I know I'm going to use approvals in this section, so I'm going to go ahead and enable approvals for the section, and then I'll go ahead and start setting up my page. So this is the section wizard. This is the page designer. So whether I'm working with a existing section or building a new section, the functionality is the same. It's got the page layout here where I can start adding fields to my page. I can see my profile section, I can see my main page, I can see my tabs, and I can decide how I want all of that to look. So if I want to add a new field, I'm going to go ahead and just drag out the type of field that I want. We'll go ahead and start with, say, our status. We're going to give it a name. Again, we're going to give it a backend name, a code. We're going to pick which lookup to use. So normally I would not have done this, but again, interest of time, most of the time you're probably going to click the plus button and create a new lookup. I've already created my expense status lookup so that we could use these values right away without having to go set that up. I can choose whether I want a pop-up window or a list of values to show. I can choose what's going to happen with deletions if there's values in this field. I can even make the field read only if that's something that I want, not in this scenario, and as well as making whether this is a required field. We'll go ahead and say this is required. All right, so what else do I want to know in my expense module? Well, I want to know how much money someone's looking to get reimbursed for. So let's go ahead and add a numeric field here. So we'll make this expense amount. And this is something that's new in the latest release. You can now select which precision or type of numeric field you want right here within the section wizard. So I can go ahead and convert this to a currency field. I will also make that required, and I'll go ahead and save that. I want to know when they experience this expense. So we'll go with date incurred here. And again, I can convert this. Right now it's defaulting to a date and a time. I don't really care about the time for this particular data point, so I'll make that to a date field. We'll go ahead and make that required. I also am going to want to track some steps along the way. So I'm going to want to know when they submitted this expense. And this one I think I will leave as a date time. We're going to go ahead and timestamp that automatically through a business process. And I also want to know when it was approved. So same thing here. We'll leave that one as a date time as well. I want to know who submitted this expense. I'll go ahead and just use the created by, which is a default field here for that. I could also have added a new field for that instead if I wanted. And I want to give them a place to put in some notes about what that description is. Again, I could put a new field in for this. I could use the notes field. We'll go ahead and put the notes field in. I'm going to change that label to be description. And we'll make that a little bit bigger. You can just drag and drop to adjust the size of that field on the page. Depending on, my business, I may want to know what customer or prospect was related to this particular expense. So I might want to add, a lookup to, say, the account object where I could track that information. I might want to track which contact was being visited. I might want to track an opportunity or a lead that it was tied to. So I could go ahead and create, any of those connections as well by just creating a lookup to those records. And I think at this point, that's probably the basics of what I need. So we'll go ahead and continue on. So the next thing that I want to do is I don't want these date submitted and date approved fields to show up until they're relevant. When someone's putting a request in for expense reimbursement, I don't want them to see those fields. I don't want them filling them in. So I'm going to go over to the business rules section. It's going to need to do a save here for us to save those new fields that we created so we can use them in our business rules. So that's going to take a moment or two here. And what we're going to do in the business rules is we're going to set up some rules to show or hide those two date fields so that they only show up when they're relevant. You can use business rules to show and hide fields, as well as in the latest release, they've added the ability to show and hide tabs, field groupings. So basically details any sort of section of the screen, any sort of data element or group of data elements can be shown or hidden through business rules with the latest release. You can also use business rules to make things required in certain situations. So we saw when I was setting up the fields, I could make a field always required. But if I want a field required sometimes but not other times, I can do that through business rules. Same thing if I want it editable some of the times. If I want to filter the values in a lookup at all. And this one is also brand new in the latest release. There's also now the option to populate values into fields based off of business rules. So in this case, I'm going to make a couple of simple business rules here. I want to use the date submitted field to drive whether or not it shows up, because we're going to populate that field later automatically. So if the field is filled in, then we're going to show that field on the page. If it's not filled in, the field's going to be hidden and users won't be able to access that information. I could also potentially, do a business rule here to make it read only, in that situation. We're not going to worry as much about that at this point for the sake of time again here. Whoops. Got some nice error checking there. That was not intentional on my part, but I forgot to fill in the condition here. This is where, having those tools be smart enough to help warn me of those errors is really important as well. That's something that Creatio is continuing to develop. I know Deneen mentioned it briefly in her slides. I think that's really cool that they're moving towards AI to guide application development as well, so that they can help anticipate what issues you might run into or what you might need to do, and really help you build those applications. All right, so at this point, we have built out our page. We've added our business rules. And the next thing that we're going to do is go over to the case designer. And we're going to build out a what's called dynamic case management, a case. This is going to guide our users through the process of submitting an expense. So we're going to use the status field here to guide that process. And we'll go ahead and create a new case here that's going to help define what the steps are in the process so that the users know what comes next. You can use this as sort of a assistance function where you're guiding your users through a process. You can use it as an enforcement tool where you're forcing users to follow the right steps. So it's got a variety of applications. If you're using the Creatio sales tool, you've probably seen this in the leads and or the opportunities sections off the bat. This one, again, we're doing some saving here to make sure it's got all the information that it needs to help us build the case. So we're just going to be patient. And while we're waiting on this, I am just remembering that I meant to mention this before and I didn't. What we're building today is something that you could build using any of the Creatio products. So if you're using Creatio sales, marketing, service, or even studio, pop-up blocked, okay. Any of those tools, any of those Creatio products would allow you to build an application, the application we're building today. I'm not using anything that's tied to any specific product. All right, so now we are in the dynamic case management tool. This is, again, going to allow us to build out the steps in our process for submitting an expense. So the first thing that I like to do here is set up all my stages. So this is going to be kind of high level. What are the steps in the process? And this is going to be tied to the field that I picked back here, my status field. So it's just deciding which stages or which statuses are relevant to this particular process. In this scenario, we just have a single process. All of our expenses are going to follow the same process, but you could potentially have different categories of expenses with different processes that apply to them. And so that's why they're going to ask you to set up which statuses are relevant to this particular case, this particular process. So as you saw, it's already tied to the values in my lookup, which I had, that's the thing I preset before the event today was those values. So I've gone ahead and I've picked each of my different stages and I've set up the different stages in my process. Now I'm going to work on what happens within each stage, as well as how the record is going to move from one stage to the next. So while the expense submission is in the draft stage, I need to remind the user to maybe put some information in about their expenses. So for example, one thing that I might need is copies of receipts. And so I can create an activity, a task for the user here to go ahead and remind them to attach copies of all receipts. And once I go ahead and give that a name, it will then pop up over here on the right with the kind of standard activity creation fields. I can go ahead and pick a category for this. I'm going to go ahead and just leave that in the to-do category. I could even create a, my own category just for this particular process if I needed to by going into my task category lookup settings. How long I want this to last, whether it should show in a calendar, who's going to do this task. We'll go ahead and leave that set to the current user, meaning the person who's currently working on this expense. Give them a hint. I will make sure it's connected to the main record. If I wanted this connected elsewhere, I could go ahead and do that as well. Set up when it's performed. Does it prompt the user to do this step as soon as that stage starts, or does it wait till the step before it was completed? That becomes more important as I have subsequent events in a particular stage. And then, is this step required or optional? This one's really an important setting because it's going to control how the user can move through these stages. So if it's an optional step, it's almost like a hint to the user to do that activity, but there's nothing actually forcing them to go ahead and do that. If it's a required step, it will actually not let the user advance to the next stage until this step is completed. So if I want to make sure the user actually completes this step, I would want this to be a required step. One important thing I just want to make sure I'm clarifying here, though, is this is really just the user saying that they have attached all the copies of the receipts. I'm not actually going to check to see if they've done that. Theoretically, you could do that through a business process. Probably would be a little bit more elegant to do a little bit of coding for that. Creatio's low code, it's not necessarily no code. There are scenarios where, something can be done a little bit more cleanly or elegantly through a coded application or a coded approach. Although there was a really cool similar scenario in one of the Creatio sessions. I'll have to find that so Deneen can send you the link with the follow-up, where she was doing a pretty similar process, and she did have a sub-process set up where she was checking to make sure that this previous step was completed. So that is something that you can do. Something else that we can do, I'm not going to use it on this step, but I'll use it elsewhere, is we can have this automatically change the stage after the user completes something. So in this case, I'm going to let the user decide when they're done putting in all of the information for their expense. I'm not going to automatically submit it for them, but we will use that to go from the submitted stage to the approved stage if the expense is approved. So in the submitted stage, I do want to use the approval function in Creatio to have someone approve the expense. I'll go ahead and select that option, give it a name, and again, it's going to go ahead and bring up the details over here on the right for me to fill in. So, what's being approved, really important. Who's going to do the approval? You've got a variety of options there to drive it based off of the user, whose record this is, their manager, a specific role of, category of users. I'm going to go ahead and just make the same user approve it for the purpose of easily demoing this today. And then I can pick a specific person, or I can also just say, pull in the current user. I can also set whether or not that person can pass on approval to others, let them delegate it. I will probably want to let that person know that their approval is required. So there are a variety of different kind of pre-built email notifications that I can send here with the triggers already built in, so I can notify someone that approval is required. I would need to set up an email template for that. So I would come over here to my template builder. If you've used the marketing product at all, or if you set up any other email templates in Creatio, you may have seen this before. or I can come in here and I can quickly build out an email template. We're going to keep this really basic. Please approve this request. Put in a link to the object and save that. Save, close. All right, so I've got my template set up now. I can go ahead and I can go back and edit that later if I want to add more information. And it would go ahead and notify this person that that's needed. You can also set up an email to notify about the result. Was it approved? Was it declined? In the interest of time, we're going to skip past that. We are going to make this a required step, and we are going to set it up to change the stage after this is completed. So this is going to give me the ability to pick the results and go to the appropriate stage based off of that. If the result is positive, meaning it was approved, we're going to go ahead and go to the approved stage. If the result is negative, meaning it was not approved, we're going to go back to the draft stage. We could also just cancel the request. So depending on whether you want to give the user a chance to revise and resubmit, or if you want them to just get declined or start over, you could pick the appropriate, action there. And you could add more steps in some of these other stages. Again, in the interest of time, we're going to keep this pretty simple. We're going to go ahead and continue on. I do want to show you one other setting that I typically like to use in the dynamic case management, which is controlling where the stages can go next. So you can allow users to skip ahead to jump past stages, or you can say you have to go to the next stage. When there's a draft expense, I want the user to have to go to either submitted or canceling that. I don't want them to be able to go to approved or paid. And so I can go through to each of these stages and say, okay, these are the appropriate next steps at this point. We don't want to allow to go anywhere else. You can also do things like adjust the colors if you want some of these different stages to stand out. You can do that. And so you have the ability to kind of, make it look different as well along the way. You can group stages that way. We'll go ahead and save at this point. We're going to save our case, and then we need to save our section. So we can go ahead and close out of this. This one's going to take a little bit longer because it's saving kind of all of the changes that we've made across all of those different steps so far. All of the work we've done to build out this application was all done in the section wizard up until this point. All right, those changes have been applied. So we're going to go back to our kind of main page here. We're going to do a control F5, kind of a forced refresh to make sure it's picking up changes and not using the cache. And we should then have our expenses section here, which we do. That's great. Before we go take a look at that, I do want to do a couple of quick business processes. I'm running a little bit, I think, behind schedule, but it's going to be close on time. So what I wanted to do with business processes is I wanted to fill in those date time fields. So what I'm going to do is trigger this automatically. So it's going to be a signal start type to run this business process when an expense is submitted. And so I'm going to set up the conditions for that. This is going to trigger based on obviously the expenses section when a record is modified, and specifically the status is modified. And we want the status to be equal to submitted. So this is setting up when the process is going to start. Once the process starts, what I want to do is I want to modify that record to set that date submitted field. So we're going to modify an expenses record. We're going to tell it which record to modify. So we have to say we want to modify the one that started this event. We can use the record ID to do that. So we can pull in the ID from that start event and use that as our filter. And then what we want to do is we want to modify that date submitted field. We're going to go ahead and use the option here to set it to the current date and time. So when this process runs, when the expense is submitted, fill in that date submitted field with the current date and time. If I didn't want to use the dynamic case management to show the different stages within the expense process, I could also set up the approval from here. It's going to be in this menu. So I don't have to use the dynamic case management in order to do approvals. I'm going to have the same set of options here. If I want to kind of drive the next step, I would need to use gateways for that. So I'd have to do a little bit of the routing here in the business process. However, I did want to point out that you don't have to use dynamic case management in order to use approvals. All right, now that I have built out that process, I can take this and copy it to do a kind of really quick same thing for an expense approved. If I can spell. So I'm going to take this and modify the condition. We'll start when it's approved. And instead of setting the date submitted, we'll set the date approved. So we'll take this field out, add in the date approved field, and set that the same way to do the current time when this process runs. And we'll save that. All right, we should be all set now. So we'll go ahead and do one more Control F5 to make sure we've picked up all those changes. And now if we go to our expenses section, all right, I've left myself 5 minutes to show you that it works, so that's great. So we'll go ahead and create a new expense. By the way, we could take the name field out or have it auto-populate with something if we don't want the user to name it themselves. We can also set this so that it defaults to the draft status. If I have a minute or two left when I'm done, I'll show you that. I did have the expense amount and the date incurred required, so it is giving me an error that I don't have my expense amount filled in yet. Let's say I've spent $100 and I did that, let's say, earlier this week. So we'll go ahead and save that. Here's our dynamic case management up at the top of the screen. So this is where we can see all of those different stages. You can see it's not letting me go to some of these stages. Actually, it's twofold at this point. Some of them, it's just because I can't go from the draft stage to the approved stage. Some of them, it's not going to let me go to the submitted stage because I haven't done that required activity yet. You can see that activity is marked with the red star to show me it's required. If it wasn't a required activity, it would not have the red star and it would let me move past that without completing. So let's go ahead and add an attachment in here so that we're following the process. So let me just grab a random picture here. We'll take this guy, drop him in. You can drag and drop your attachments in. You can also, if you prefer the pop-up navigate, you can go that way as well. And then we'll go ahead and say we're good to go. We're going to submit our request. Actually, I better say that I did this first, so we'll go ahead and complete this task. And mark that as completed. And now I'm going to submit it. And again, you could have that advance automatically if you wanted. I chose not to. Because I am setting myself as the approver, I can now see the approval required step here. The approver would also get a notification over here. Mine is so high because of these 99 alerts there that we didn't see it, the number change, but you would see this number go up because you'd get an alert here that you have an approval required. So here that is, and I could click through from there, as well as that email alert that we had set up. This person can then approve or reject, or since we allowed delegation, they can change who's going to approve that request and pass that on to somebody else. Let's go ahead and approve this request. It's now automatically advanced to the approved stage. We didn't set up any tasks at this point, so it's just sitting in approved. You may want, an email alert or a dashboard that the person in accounting who's paying these, gets alerted to these approved requests. You may at this point have an integration over to your accounting system that passes this along over there and maybe automatically marks this as paid once that's been paid. And I can go ahead and finish off the process. If instead that expense wasn't approved, whoops, draft, because they wanted $1,000, and put our attachment in, complete our activity, submit it. By the way, I didn't actually point this out, but you could see, other than the fact that my time zone is clearly not set correctly, it is time stamping that for me as we do those stages. We'll go ahead and reject it this time. It does ask me for some notes at this point on why am I rejecting that. And it goes back to the draft stage, restarts that stage. So now back in the, attach all copies of the receipt step, and the user could then resubmit that.